Hey, what's up? Welcome back. Alright, let's get back into the story of Alexander the Great, the most interesting man in the world. So I'll set the scene for you. Wine flowing freely, maybe some Cav Sav, barefoot Moscato, banquet levels of food, all the good stuff. Soon, all the king's friends and guests were feeling themselves, that wine drunk. So everyone is laughing, having a good time, including Alexander's friend Ptolemy. Ptolemy just happened to bring his mistress with him, a lady called Thais from Athens. Thais, who was probably a little drunk, drank too much Moscato, and she wanted to give a speech. So she took her shot at giving a passionate speech to Alexander and everyone else. She proclaimed that it was a fine reward, after wandering over Asia, to dine in luxury at the splendid palace of Xerxes. But it would be so much sweeter pleasure to set fire to the house of the man who had burned down her city. And at that, the crowd went wild, everyone was cheering. Alexander, clearly moved by the speech, all too eagerly grabbed the nearest torch. He then set fire to the cedar columns and rafters of the building, sparking everyone to do the same. Soon the whole place was a burning rage of fire. Alexander almost immediately began to regret what he just did, so he tried to put out the fires, but by then he just couldn't do it, it was too late. And by morning there was nothing left but scorched pillars and ashes. That's some pretty crazy stuff. It goes to show what wine can do. Oh, and there is one more story on that same night, though it's by the historian Arrian. He actually doesn't, which does make it more believable then. So what he said happened is that the king planned all along to burn the palace, even ignoring Parmenian's pleas telling him not to. Parmenian tried to tell him it's stupid to burn down what's now yours. Arrian then said that Alexander countered that he wanted revenge for all the evils the Persians had done to the Greek world. Then he simply burned it all to the ground. So which one is true? I don't know. What do you believe is more fitting of Alexander's character? Did he just do some stupid thing when he was drunk? Or was it more in his character to take a deliberate action to burn it all down, message, and show his power? Well, whatever you believe, in the end, it ended up being ashes. So with the fun and games of killing, destroying, and so on being concluded, it was time again to set off and hunt down Darius. Before leaving though, he did the usual stuff with making appointments and commands, and a Macedonian in charge of the military affairs. And once the snow in the 400 miles between Persepolis and Ecbatana, the Median capital where Darius had spent the winter, finally melted away, Alexander readied his army for a wicked fast march up the eastern side of the Zagros Mountains. At a pace of 20 miles a day, which puts my 10,000 steps a day to shame, Alexander and his army pushed past parched hills and moved north hoping to get Darius. At one point in the journey, he got word that Darius was going to make a final stand at Ecbatana, so he kept up pace. But a few days later, he got news that Darius was now running away toward Bactria, which is Moldavia. Alexander, now 3 days out from Ecbatana, a Persian noble named Bisthanes arrived at Alexander's camp. This guy was the only son of the king before Darius, Artaxerxes III. He surely didn't like Darius, so he and other nobles wanted to throw in with Alexander instead. To pay his men and hire more to fight Alexander for years. That made him both equally mad and worried. He didn't want to fight this guerrilla-style warfare indefinitely. So to prevent this, Alexander knew he needed to be the embodiment of speed. But in spite of the hurry, he needed to make a quick, radical change. He sent the Thessalian cavalry back to Greece with large bonuses, but said any could stay as paid volunteers rather than subject soldiers, with even larger bonuses if they wanted, and most jumped at the chance. Alexander cleverly wanted to reassign the cavalry as they were the backbone of Parmenian support. They were then, of course, loyal to Parmenian, which Alexander didn't want. So sending them either back home or making them now wealthy volunteer soldiers made them in return loyal to him. Next, Alexander informed Parmenian that he was to stay and guard the treasury at Ecbatana. He assured him it was important and a good reward for just being such a great general. Plus, at 70 years old, the guy probably needed a break. Parmenian was not an old fool, though. Old, yeah, but foolish, no. He knew from the start, on this whole conquest, only Parmenion and his 2 sons actually had significant positions. And now, Alexander was cutting the old men out from being a top general to just some guy on guard duty at a treasury. With that out of the way, Alexander set out from Ecbatana after Darius. He raced through several days before. Camping there that night, a Babylonian named Bagasthenes and Antibelas, the son of the satrap Mazaeus, came to Alexander with news they had heard upon leaving Darius's camp. Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, arrested Darius with the support of another satrap and were fleeing with him as a captive in their wagon. Alexander thought something like that might happen, which he didn't want because he wanted to capture Darius himself and sort of end the war for good. So in response to the news, Alexander lightened his troops even more to a lighter force and pursued Bessus. Soon enough, he reached the camp where Darius previously was. Talking with the Persians there that remained, Alexander discovered that Bessus assumed the title of Great King with the support of the Bactrian cavalry. Now he was pissed even more. Alexander lightened his men and pushed farther on, reaching another camp where the Persians had been. He asked the people there if there was any type of shortcut through the desert so he could overtake Bessus. Well, there was, but it was a completely waterless route, even rarely taken by caravans. So what does Alexander do? The usual impossible nonsense. And put his most fit infantry on their horses and set off on this route in the middle of the night at full speed. Covering almost 50 miles in darkness, at the break of dawn he at last saw Persians in the distance. When the Persians saw the Macedonians as well, most fled in panic, even though they probably outnumbered Alexander. Bessus, fleeing with Darius in his pursuers. So Bessus rushed to the wagon holding Darius and stabbed him with a spear, leaving him for dead. Quickly, Bessus and his cavalry then fled east into the mountains. Alexander and the Macedonians camped closer to what was now a mixture of confusion with men, horses, and carts racing in different directions. He sent search parties to find Darius, and eventually one soldier named Polystratus finds the bloody king, barely alive, in the wagon. Now there are different traditions of the story of how he dies after being found. In one, Alexander is there to see his adversary pass away, with his final words bequeathing everything to Alexander. In other stories, Darius asked Polystratus in broken Greek to give Alexander his blessing on being a noble opponent. But maybe the most truthful one is in which Darius, seeing Polystratus find him, motions for water. The young soldier gave him some, and then, slowly, even Alexander wouldn't have wanted Darius to go that way, practically alone and dying with no respect. In Alexander's mind, he saw himself capturing Darius in his elegantly kingly robes and greeting him with respect. Darius would then abdicate the throne, handing over the empire to Alexander, giving his own daughter in marriage to cement the new bond between the houses. Then Alexander would let Darius retire somewhere in luxury under closed guard. But now the King of Kings was dead in the back of a wagon, betrayed by his friends and allies. And out of respect, Alexander ordered his body to be sent to Persepolis. But now with Darius dead and gone, the Macedonians were wonderfully happy. After following Alexander thousands of miles, the great king was finally dead. They had all made more money than they ever would have as shepherds and farmers back home, and after 4 years they were ready to enjoy their wealth with their families. Happy cheer quickly turned to rumor that indeed the war was over. Alexander heard about this somehow, and it beats me, he convinced them to continue on the campaign east. Supposedly he did so by striding to the assembly grounds and calling his soldiers before him, speaking to them as both their king and a fellow soldier. He goes on to give them a motivational speech, "When am I to come?" That is actually pretty sweet and makes me feel lazy. It's probably a beautiful performance when he delivered it, even more so because Alexander was doing just that. He was performing. All he wanted was to keep going on his campaign, so he said anything and everything the army would have wanted to hear, and it worked. The road to Bactria lay east, but Alexander first went north to the land of Hyrcania on the south shore of the Caspian Sea. Being a heavily populated area in the breadbasket of the Persian Empire, Alexander had established control. Dividing his forces into 3 groups, he marched into Hyrcania He sent Craterus forward with one group, left another officer in charge of the main force and supplies, while he and his group headed up the steepest road to Hyrcania in order to reach it first. Eventually, Alexander and the Macedonians descended from the mountains and stood on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Once in Hyrcania, Alexander soon was off west to deal with a tribe called the Mardi. They refused to offer tribute, so Alexander and his forces killed them where they could, driving the rest into the mountains. In retaliation, the Mardi struck back. On a day when the royal pages were leading the king's horses to graze, a group of Mardi stole a single horse, the finest one they saw. They surely thought that they would earn the king's respect and perhaps be granted some concessions, but they picked the wrong man and the wrong horse. Alexander was probably more willing to lose half of his kingdom than the horse he trained and loved since he was a boy. So he sent his soldiers into the mountains with orders to destroy the entire country, cut down every tree and every man. Here in Persepolis, he would turn their home into nothing but a wasteland. The Mardi were quick to realize that they made a bad choice. They decided to send Persepolis back with gifts and begged for forgiveness, which Alexander gave them. He just kept a few hostages, though, to ensure further good behavior. So another 2 weeks went by in Hyrcania, dealing with some administration stuff, holding athletic contests, sacrificing, and all the usual stuff. And finally, after all that, he was back on the chase for Bessus. 200 miles later, Alexander made his way to the sea. There he met a Persian satrap named Setabarzanes, who surrendered to him. He also informed Alexander that Bessus had reached Bactria, was gathering allies from places like Scythia, and had taken the title of Artaxerxes V. That was news Alexander didn't want. He quickly left Setabarzanes as satrap and a Macedonian named Anaxapis as a leader of the honor guard. The king and his army then moved out towards Bactria. On the march to Bactria, Alexander began to accelerate a policy that he had been slowly implementing since Persepolis. He began to dress more Persian, including a purple diadem and white robes like the Great King. He kept Persian concubines, more so for appearance though rather than use. He sealed letters to Asia with the seal he had taken from Darius, and even encouraged his men to marry Persian women. His goal was to be both king of Macedonia and the Great King for all his Asian subjects. He was trying to walk a super thin line. Nicanor died, leaving only Philotas as his last son. So Alexander decided to leave Philotas to deal with funeral rites, and Alexander just moved on. And moving on, he got news that the satrap Setabarzanes he appointed rebelled and killed Anaxapis to join Bessus. So Alexander left Craterus with the main force, telling him to follow him to Chortacana, headed for the city, and got there crazy quick, throwing the city into a panic. But Setabarzanes had fled. Alexander hurried to chase him, but could not catch him. So instead, he turned to the mountains where various refugee soldiers were hiding, for a means of releasing some anger, I guess. Eventually, he found various soldiers, and they were all killed off. He ordered his men to set fires to trees they had just cut down, burning the whole forested area, with all the men hiding included. After that, Alexander returned to Chortacana, where the citizens surrendered and pleaded with him to leave them in peace and reserve his anger for the satrap. He said sure, whatever, pardoned them, left behind a garrison, and was happily met at the same time by reinforcements from Antipater back in Macedon, almost 7,000 more troops. With these new men, he thought it'd be perfect timing to go and try and take Bessus from the south. Before he could do that, a new problem occurred closer to home. There was another assassination plot on Alexander. A Macedonian named Dimnus had a plot to kill Alexander, but for an unknown reason. Well, Dimnus told his lover Nicomachus of the plot, normal cute pillow talk stuff, but Nicomachus wanted no part of it and tried to get word to Alexander. Sabellinus tried to get word to Alexander through others, one of which was Philotas, the son of Parmenion and leader of the Old Guard faction of the troops. Philotas, whether not believing the plot or perhaps wanting it to happen, didn't bother telling Alexander. Well, the guy didn't give up on trying to get word to Alexander, so he tried getting word to the right people. And eventually he did. And once the king heard the plot, he ordered Dimnus, the plotter, to be arrested. But the guy fought back, so the Macedonians trying to arrest him killed him, and that sort of solidified the guilt of the guy in Alexander's eyes. And it's at this point that Alexander's companions, who disliked Philotas, had the idea to get him involved in this assassination plot deeper than just his initial part of ignoring the whole thing to begin with. And what played out was that he arrested Philotas, soldiers, so they could make the final judgment call. Most of the soldiers actually admired Philotas as a fellow soldier and a leader, but they also disliked how he spent his private life, which he was quite lush with. And Philotas, to the disdain of the soldiers, chose to address them in his trial by using the Greek language, Macedonian soldiers, like the regular rank-and-file people who spoke Macedonian. So they promptly decided he was to be killed, and they stoned him to death. Next, knowing the news would reach Parmenion, Alexander sent a secret message via his friend Polydamas at breakneck speed to the 4 lieutenants. They read the message in disbelief, but told the messenger they would do what the king ordered. So the 4 lieutenants, including Alexander's companion Cleander, approached Parmenion. And soon enough, Cleander and the 4 lieutenants cut down the old man, leaving one of the greatest soldiers in Macedonian history as a bloodied corpse on the ground. That's a rough way to go at 70 years old. The question is, though, do you think Philotas and Parmenion ever wanted to kill Alexander, or was Alexander just doing his usual thing to try to get rid of people he really didn't want around? And whether they wanted to or not, they did pose the most serious threat to Alexander's throne. And with their removal, Alexander surely removed a weight off his soldiers from ridding himself of potential usurpers. So with another average day complete in the life of keeping up with the Macedonians, it was time to continue on the march to get Bessus and his allies. So where we are at now is almost 1,500 miles away from Persepolis. The Macedonians had traveled from the Persian homeland north to Media, chased Darius east across Parthia, and taken a detour into Hyrcania on the Caspian Sea. Alexander instead led his men south into the highlands of Aria and onto the borders of Drangiana. Once in Drangiana, a new sensible commander would have made winter camp and let his men rest for a few months. But Alexander was either too concerned to catch Bessus or was worried by any potential discontent with the whole Philotas affair toward the peaks of the Hindu Kush. Pressing on, he soon received word that there was trouble brewing back in Aria, yet again by Setabarzanes. Alexander didn't want to turn back, so he sent his friend and cavalry commander Erigius of Lesbos with around 6,000 men to deal with him. And what follows is a bit sketchy on the details, but there was this fierce battle between the two forces. Supposedly what happened was that Setabarzanes and Erigius found each other fighting. They looked at each other and were like, 1v1 me, and the two went at it. Erigius went beast on him though, and jammed his spear in the satrap's face, prompting all his rebel soldiers to flee into the mountains. Okay, cool. Back to Alexander. Alexander was still moving on his way to the Hindu Kush. Along the way, he founded another city named Alexandria, which would eventually become present-day Kandahar in Afghanistan. After the founding of another Alexandria, to the north lay the Hindu Kush, a towering range averaging almost 15,000 feet in height, with the highest peaks well over 20,000 feet. And besides the treacherous-looking mountains, the valleys of the Hindu Kush also contained some fierce tribes that were mainly pastoral, but were not afraid going forward. They did. The Macedonians journeyed north from Alexandria to the valley of Kabul, taking weeks of struggle over snowy passes and icy peaks. Dragging their way on, they'd often come across mountain villages where they would take old inhabitants' food, pretty much leaving them to starve till the next harvest. That continued. Alexander then gave his men some time to rest, but wanted to keep going. Between them and Bactria were still some of the highest peaks of the Hindu Kush. He couldn't wait for early summer to melt the snow. He needed to catch Bessus off guard by moving quickly. So before he made his men get ready to march again, he founded another Alexandria, called Alexandria in the Caucasus, which gave his men a little more time to rest. With the new Alexandria complete, it was time for the king to make a choice on what path forward he would take north. Several choices were available, but really only one made logical sense. There was one western corridor path that had an altitude of around 10,000 feet, but Alexander was thinking that's the one Bessus wanted him to do. Since Bessus was applying a scorched earth policy, Alexander could not follow a path that Bessus left barren. The path opposite, the eastern route called the Kawak Pass, was the most illogical choice. 12,000 feet above the sea level, the most difficult trail crossing with little shelter over deep snow. But of course that's the one Alexander picked. Leading his army of tens of thousands behind him, the king advanced up into the highest mountains any of them had ever seen. The first pass was almost 50 miles long and so narrow that the men had to walk single file. And remember, this is still deep in winter, so imagine walking single file on a snow and ice-filled path where if you look down to the side, your stomach would drop at the sight. Carrying on, somewhere in the area, some native guides showed Alexander a peak rising above 3,000 feet on the trail, where God had been chained when he stole fire from the heavens. They even pointed out the scratches on the stone made by the eagle sent by the angry lord of the gods to peck at the thief as punishment. Alexander, of course, recognized the tale of Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from Zeus to give to men. The titan was chained to a pillar and his liver eaten every day by an eagle, in the process. In the end to that story, Hercules, Alexander's believed ancestor, eventually rescued Prometheus. Alexander, always trying to follow or one-up his ancestors and heroes, he would have been very happy to know that he was traveling the same lands as Hercules had. Unguarded by Bessus, who probably never thought Alexander would be crazy enough to try that route. The army began climbing down the Kawak Pass, where now the winter ice moved to a more blistering heat in just a matter of days. To make matters worse, it was not just hot, but little food and resources could be found. Even various towns throughout Bactria didn't have any, nowhere to be found. He had yet again retreated, this time to Sogdiana, helped by Spidomenes, a Sogdian lord with a very good cavalry. Fortunately though, when Bessus left the Bactrians, they really didn't care and just went back to their regular life. So Alexander appointed an old family friend called Artabazus as the new satrap of Bactria and headed north to the Oxus, again chasing Bessus. When the army reached the Oxus, dehydrated and exhausted, some had had enough. In fear of any potential mutiny, Alexander simply bought off those who were discontent and sent them away. Even if it meant he'd be short of soldiers for battle. With the discontented soothed, it was time for Alexander to cross the Oxus, a swift, cold, and deep river fed by melting snow from high in the Pamir Mountains in the east. Unfortunately, crossing wouldn't be easy. There was not enough wood in the surrounding area to build a bridge, nor did Alexander have any boats, so he decided to do what he had done back on the Danube 6 years earlier. He ordered his men to stuff their tents with dry straw and grass and float across, which worked but took 5 days due to the size of the army. Now the Macedonians, River, and the steppes of Central Asia, a boundless grassland stretching on forever. In the east lay mountains and deserts. It was probably both unsettling and extremely cool to see for the Macedonians. To them, this would have seemed like the edge of the world. Sightseeing aside, the Macedonians moved. These were descendants of the Bronchidae, the priests of Apollo at Didma near Miletus on the Aegean coast of Asia Minor. Their ancestors had been deported by Xerxes the previous century in order to protect them from the hostile Greeks after they had collaborated with the great king and burned down their own temple. But that was ancient history to the descendants. They kept their language, religion, and many traditions. But when Alexander arrived, they welcomed him kindly and surrendered the city to him. However, when Alexander retired to his tent for the night, he called together the soldiers from Miletus that were serving in his army. He asked them what he should do about these people. The men of Miletus since childhood were more or less raised to hate the priests, so many wanted revenge, while a few others thought it best to just forget the past. After hearing their opinions, Alexander thanked them and said he'd think on what to do. The next morning, Alexander entered the town and was again warmly welcomed by the people. But their warm welcome quickly faded when they saw that behind Alexander was soldiers with swords drawn. And quickly their warm joy turned to horror. Every man, woman, and child was killed in spite of their cries for mercy in Greek. The town was sacked, and the houses were destroyed for mercy in Greek. The town was sacked, and the houses were destroyed. Even the sacred grove they had was cut down and the stumps pulled up so that no trace of them could ever remain. To be honest, I have no idea why he would do that. Definitely used to him massacring people, but these were, great-great-grand, actually a major D-bag move. Anyways, by now the Sogdians were aware that Alexander was in their country and began to have second thoughts about Bessus. So Spidomenes and his men arrested Bessus and sent a message to Alexander that they would give him up if Alexander just sent a party to lead him back to the Macedonian camp to retrieve Bessus. Wandering close though, Ptolemy got a message that said Spidomenes was now uncertain if he should hand him over. So Ptolemy decided to surround the village with his soldiers, which prompted Spidomenes and his officers to flee. Ptolemy, leaving most of his troops encircling the area, entered the town with a handful of men, marched to the hut where Bessus was and dragged him out before any local could object. He then sent a messenger to Alexander asking what to do. The king replied that Bessus should be tied naked to a pole with a wooden collar around his neck and placed on the road that the army would soon pass. Soon enough, Alexander arrived. He got down from his horse and approached Bessus. He asked the man by what right he had seized the great king in the first place, betraying a sacred trust that bound him to both his relative and his benefactor. How dare he put him in chains like a slave? Bessus weakly responded that he didn't act alone and thought Alexander would be happy. He's probably hoping now he still might have a slim chance at survival, but this is Alexander he's talking to, so honestly there's slim chances. So Alexander first decided that he would torture him. He would have him flogged and then cut off his ears and nose, the traditional to be delivered to the family of Darius. When Bessus arrived to the former great king's brother and relatives, they inflicted every possible torture on him. The worst stuff you could think of, they did. Then they promptly cut him into pieces. Great way to bond as a family. Probably beats Sunday game night. Well, more. With his free time, he decided to take advantage of moving through some of the finest horse country and acquiring some new mounts. Next, the king led his army 200-ish miles north to the ancient city of Markanda, or Samarkand, a royal city of the Persians in central Sogdiana. He quickly made a key garrison and kept going north to the Chexartes, the farthest boundary of the Persian Empire. Beyond it was the land of the Scythians, which is the name given to all the tribes of the steppe more or less. Here some things started to go wrong. Sogdian warriors were attacking Macedonians, despite their lord giving up Bessus to the Macedonians. Alexander and a large force went to deal with these warriors. They put up a hell of a fight, even shooting Alexander in the leg, breaking his fibula. Eventually the Macedonians dealt with the Sogdians, and Alexander laid out a new long-term plan for all the lands. There were these 7 garrison towns that the Persians used to fortify their borders with the Scythians, while Alexander wanted to strengthen those and make new posts of his own. One important one was to be called Alexandria Escate, or Alexandria the Farthest. But Alexander's plan was to invade Scythia. This is actually the first hint in ancient sources that speak to Alexander's grand scheme of wanting to expand farther than just the Persian Empire boundaries. He dreamed of conquests greater and greater, and given that he was still so young, he had plenty of time to keep going. That dreaming was quickly interrupted though, garrisons and retaking those 7 border cities. So swift and decisively, Alexander dealt with them city by city and soldier by soldier. Soon the 7 cities were in his control again, and he spared no Sogdian who stood in his way. As days and weeks passed, Alexander had to deal with Spidomenes and his Sogdians and the Scythians. He had to fight guerrilla-style strikes against his men, struggle to maintain his hold on the frontier, and not to mention was practically injured or ill the entire time. And after what must have felt like an eon, Alexander's childhood friend Nearchus arrived with fresh officers and more than 20,000 mercenaries. The new recruit surely gave Alexander some of the much more needed confidence. But months went by, and the back and forth fighting was really just annoying Alexander. Suddenly it had hit him about how he'd spent 2 full campaigning seasons in Sogdiana, and that surely pissed him off. He just wanted to move on to conquest. And by now, it was the end of summer, and nothing really good had happened. So one day, Alexander was just chilling in his tent, and he got sent a shipment of fruit that arrived all the way from Greece. It looked so good, he sent for his friend Cletus the Black to enjoy it with him. Cletus, however, was in the middle of sacrificing some sheep, but getting word that Alexander wanted him, he just left in the middle of the sacrifice. The sheep, being sheep, followed Cletus to Alexander's tent. And the king was horrified at the sight, and he thought it was a bad omen. Theirs to interpret this. They said the sheep following Cletus meant ill will for the man. That terrified Alexander, so he ordered sacrifices to be made to the gods for the protection of his friend. And a little after this debacle, Alexander threw a bit of a banquet in his quarters for his men and some other Persians and foreigners with the usual fine food and, of course, wine. That night, there was this bard singing songs satirizing the Macedonian generals failing to capture the Sogdian Spidomenes. Alexander's young friends loved it, but the older officers were insulted because they were trying their best. As the songs and verses went on and on, Alexander's friends started to even insult Alexander's father Philip, and said that he was pretty much nothing compared to Alexander, both in terms of being a king and a soldier. And that didn't bode well with the older officers who used to be Philip's friends. At the negative remarks toward Philip, Cletus, just as drunk as everyone else, rose to his feet and declared in front of foreign barbarians. Alexander in return teased Cletus, saying that he was just offering excuses to get off topic for his failure to capture Spidomenes. He just was trying to avoid acknowledging his own failures and cowardice, and at that, Cletus exploded. He asked Alexander if it was his cowardice. Perhaps the king forgot that all the Macedonian blood spilled was just so he could continue on his conquest. Now Alexander was boiling. The mood in the tent turned from fun to icy disdain. Alexander accused Cletus of stirring up discontent, Macedonians against foreigners. Cletus shot back that it was too late for that, since loyal Macedonians were already second-class citizens who had to beg some Persian for an audience with their own king. Alexander was fuming. He lunged at Cletus, but was held back. Cletus didn't relent with his words, though. He just kept on going. And now Alexander was done. He was already looking for a weapon and in a rage called out to summon the guards. The sober trumpeter, however, smartly refused, so Alexander beat the hell out of him. And still, Cletus hurled insults as he was dragged out of the tent by his friends. But he struggled and broke free to continue his tirade on Alexander. But before Cletus could let out another word, Alexander shook off his bodyguards, grabbed one of their spears, and ran Cletus through. Pulling the spear from his dead body, Alexander was in agony. He quickly tried bracing the spear on the ground and was ready to throw himself onto it. But his friends prevented the king from killing himself. They managed to drag him to his own quarters, where he soon collapsed in despair. For 3 full days, Alexander wept and mourned for Cletus, hardly eating or drinking at all. The army would have been leader. So to knock Alexander out of his angsty teen mood, Aristander, their ever-trusty soothsayer, came to him. Aristander told him that the death of Cletus was foreordained long ago, and Alexander was merely acting out the god's will. Susceptible as always, Alexander brightened up at the news. And after that, Aristotle's nephew, Callisthenes, the historian, arrived and gently argued that the event wasn't all too bad. But then the philosopher, Anaxarchus, barged in and was like, quit behaving like a little brat. He reminded the king that he could do whatever the hell he wanted. He was a king among men. If you want to spear a man through, he could. But if he wanted his men's respect, he had better pull himself together and go be a leader. And that Machiavellian advice actually worked. Alexander was soon up, out of his depression, and ready to go. And in spite of the gloomy events, things were looking up for the Macedonians. Soon enough, the end would come for Spidomenes. And it goes a bit like this. Spidomenes had been dragging his wife with him for the past couple years, from village to village and so on. Well, she was fed up with it. One night when Spidomenes was a servant, she wrapped the head in a cloth and rode to the Macedonian camp, where she was eventually able to see Alexander and present the head. It was soon confirmed to be Spidomenes, which made Alexander happy, and then he just sent the woman away. And that's at least the story to a historian named Curtius. Arrian, however, says that the Scythians were worried Alexander left Spidomenes' head and sent it to Alexander. Regardless of who sliced off the guy's head, the deed was done. Resistance in Sogdiana fell apart, and the Scythians sued for peace, quickly followed by the remainder of the Sogdians. Finally, the arguably most annoying part of the campaign for Alexander was finished. So we're pretty much done in Sogdiana. Dealt with them before heading to India. The last place of resistance he dealt with was a mountain fortress called the Sogdian Rock. After it fell, the whole province quickly gave up in return. Among the captives from the Sogdian Rock was the family of Oxyartes, a Bactrian nobleman. But he isn't important. His daughter, however, her name was Roxanne. So Alexander saw this girl and was like, "Whoa, hey Ptolemy, check her out." And Ptolemy was known as like, "Bro, total smoke show." So Alexander did what Alexander does, whatever the hell he wants. And what he wanted to do was marry Roxanne. And Ptolemy was known as like, "Bro, total smoke show." So Alexander did what Alexander does, whatever the hell he wants. And what he wanted to do was marry Roxanne. Then at 28 years old, Alexander, king of Macedonia and ruler of all lands from Egypt to the Hindu Kush, married Roxanne, daughter of a of Sogdiana. And according to ancient Macedonian custom, during the ceremony, or whatever part, the attendants would bring forth a fresh loaf of bread for the couple to share. Maybe kind of like the wedding cake part of weddings that we do, where the two partners feed cake to each other. But here, when the bread comes in, Alexander just straight up So what I'm saying is I think we should start using swords to cut wedding cakes. That would be a pretty Instagram-worthy shot. Alright. Now, Alexander has been officially married in the 7th year of his campaign, 327 BC, and itching to get on to India. But the king had some steps to accomplish throughout his empire as soldiers, which he needed as Macedonia obviously couldn't produce all of them. Though they weren't just foreign auxiliaries, Alexander trained them to be Macedonian soldiers. They were taught Greek and equipped with Macedonian gear. And that was a pretty bold and innovative plan at the time. Another item Alexander dealt with was the things that the Persians did, but the Macedonians did not. One above them all being the most problematic, proskynesis. The whole deal is about prostrating yourself before someone superior to you, in this case, everyone before Alexander. Persians did it for him from the get-go, but of course the Macedonians just mocked it. Alexander hoped that he could slowly introduce it, and maybe in a modified form, purely with a ceremonial connotation, not religious. And he didn't want it because he thought he was deserving or divine. He just thought it looked stupid for half his court or people to prostrate before him, and the other half were just standing and laughing at them. You can probably guess how Alexander's attempt at trying to make these rugged, proud Macedonians do proskynesis turned out. No bueno. And its failure can be mainly attributed to a guy named Callisthenes, the expedition historian. So Callisthenes was a very traditional and proud guy who really hated to lose an argument. So one night during a banquet, Alexander tried to introduce a former proskynesis to his men. Alexander would first pass a cup of wine to his nearest small shrine of a god conveniently located behind Alexander. Each guest would then receive a kiss from Alexander and return to his place on the dining couch. So this all starts happening at the banquet, but then it gets to be Callisthenes' turn. He takes the wine, but doesn't do the proskynesis part of this, but one other friend pointed it out. Alexander then confronted Callisthenes about it, and the guy had the balls to say he'd do without the kiss, thanks. My dude. Alexander arranged the death of one of his best generals, ran through one of his most loyal friends with a spear, and was prone to anger. Probably not the best response. But surprisingly, Alexander didn't do anything rash. He simply challenged Callisthenes to an impromptu oration to praise Macedonian valor. The guy was vain as hell too, so he was ready to impress. Well, his impromptu oration, and he killed it. Everyone laughed and cheered and wanted him to keep going. Well, Alexander, being educated, knew that in Greek schools of rhetoric, there was a time-honored fashion to then take the opposite stance. So, Alexander then asked him to do just that. Now he had to denounce Macedonian valor. This guy took the bait and started to say terrible things about Macedonians. Well, that guy pretty much walked right into it. Needless to say, the crowd didn't take too kindly to the oration of denouncing their valor. So they all took the criticisms at face value, and put all their anger at Callisthenes. And with a clever stroke, Alexander managed to alienate Callisthenes from any supporters he might have had. All that was left would be to silence him forever. And the opportunity for that came soon enough. Yet another assassination plot was brewing, but that one didn't get too far because the kid told his friends, who quickly betrayed him, and then the guy got arrested. Alexander decided to take this as a chance to entangle Callisthenes into the plot. Before long, Callisthenes was arrested and in chains at no objection from the Macedonians, who he just recently ridiculed. Either he was immediately hung or he died a few months later of disease, but again, it doesn't really matter how he died. Regardless, Callisthenes became the main reason why Alexander didn't move forward with the proskinesis stuff. This is just another example of how Alexander got rid of yet another who dared challenge him in the slightest. And he would need to be rid of anyone insubordinate in his realm, because next up, Alexander was finally headed to India and needed everything to go just right in this mystical and mysterious land. But for now, that'll be the end of part 3 of Alexander the Great. In part 4, we'll see the last of Alexander, from India to Babylon and the struggles he had within the time. So get ready for some more elephants, desolate deserts, lots of death, the usual homicidal decision making, and sadly, the end of Alexander. Also, comment anything cool you learned so far down below, and if you'd like to subscribe, that'd be pretty great too.